The year was 1874. The dust came early that morning, dragging with it the dry hush that always settled before judgment. Church bells didn't ring, but the townsfolk gathered all the same, lining the wide wooden porches and shadowed alleys with their whispers and waiting. Annabel Wynne stood at the center of the square, her hands bound behind the rough beam where horses were usually tied. Her dress was white, though muddied now at the hem and torn along the shoulder where the sheriff's deputy had grabbed her. She kept her chin high, not out of pride, but because it was the only thing they couldn't yet take. The sun had only just begun to climb, and already it burned against her brow. Her eyes didn't search the crowd. She knew who was there: Martha Tolliver with her sour mouth tight as a needlepoint, Reverend Crane whispering a psalm behind his teeth, and her Aunt Etta, standing off to the side with her eyes cast down as if watching her niece would stain her too. No one spoke to her. No one offered a hand or cloth or even a glance of kindness. She had refused Silas Greeley, and that in their eyes was more offensive than theft or blasphemy. Silas himself stood near the sheriff, arms crossed, his dark coat freshly pressed, every button glinting. His face bore the expression of a man scorned, but not heartbroken, possessive, not wounded. Like a child denied a toy, he watched her with the satisfaction of someone who'd paid the price and was simply waiting for the rest of the town to agree he'd been wronged. Sheriff Amos Dillard, tall and exhausted, unfolded a piece of parchment in his thick hands. He wasn't a cruel man, just tired and soft where the law required steel. He cleared his throat, but his voice cracked anyway. Annabel Wynne, he began, for refusing a lawful suitor in public, and for causing a scene unbecoming of a decent woman, this town sees fit to issue formal rebuke and temporary shunning. Let this serve as a reminder that civility must be kept. His words trailed off into the heat. No one truly listened. They came for the humiliation, not the sentence. Children squinted in curiosity, and the women tightened their bonnets. The men shifted their boots on dusty planks, unsure how long decency allowed them to stare. Annabel didn't blink. Her wrists burned where the rope bit, and her lip was split from yesterday's scuffle, but her eyes stayed clear. There was no apology in them. She had said no. Not kindly, not privately, but firmly, and Silas, with all his cattle, gold, and influence, had expected better. It was the silence that followed that struck hardest. The sheriff folded the notice. The crowd lingered. A few stones were thrown at her feet, more in ritual than rage. Someone muttered something about shame and scripture. Then a bootstep, soft, slow, unhurried. From the far end of the square came a man most didn't notice at first. He moved without sound, not from stealth, but from a lifetime of choosing when to be seen. His hair was long and dark, braided neatly over his shoulders, and his shirt was the color of river stone, faded at the sleeves. He wore no hat, bore no weapon, only calloused hands and a face carved by sun and silence. Tomas Red Moon, the blacksmith, though few ever heard him speak enough to call him that. Most in town referred to him by trade, not name. Apache, said in low voices, half wild, tolerated because he fixed their tools and shod their horses better than anyone else. He never lingered long in the saloon or church. He was always just there. Now, he crossed the square with the calm of someone walking into his own yard. People parted, not out of respect, but confusion. He didn't glance at Silas, nor the sheriff. His eyes were on Annabel alone. She watched him come, unsure if it was pity or judgment in his gaze. He stopped 3 feet from her, just enough distance for choice. Then, without a word, he reached forward and undid the knot at her wrists. The murmur sharpened, rising like smoke. What's he doing? He can't. Sheriff, do something. But the sheriff stood frozen, as if the law had reached its limit and now had to watch what came next like the rest. Tomas finished untying the rope, coiled it slowly, then tossed it aside into the dust. His eyes never left hers. His hand opened, not forceful, not urgent, just open. Annabel hesitated. She didn't know this man, had seen him once, maybe twice, hammering iron outside his forge near the ridge. But she had heard stories. He never raised his voice. He'd once carried an injured settler boy 5 miles through snow without asking for thanks. He never asked for anything. And now his hand was there, waiting. The crowd had grown deathly still. Even the horses stopped shifting. Her aunt made a small sound, half warning, half prayer. Annabelle looked down at her hands, raw and red. She looked back at Tomas. He didn't flinch, didn't urge, just stood there like the wind had asked him to. She placed her hand in his. He closed his fingers gently over hers, turned, and walked away, leading her out of the circle like he was guiding someone home from a storm. They passed Silas on the way. His face was white, his mouth trembling with the kind of rage that had never known defeat. He stepped forward, but Tomas didn't pause. His shoulders were quiet iron, and Annabelle didn't look back. They walked past the saloon, past the mercantile, past the mouths of every watching soul who would talk for weeks about what they'd just seen and still not understand it. No one stopped them. By the time they reached the edge of town, the wind had picked up again, and the dust followed them like a whisper relieved to have something true to carry. Annabelle's hand remained in his. Not gripped tight, not pulled, just there. Her arm trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of being chosen. Gently, without condition. She didn't ask where he was taking her. She didn't need to. Because something about the way he walked beside her, silent, solid, unashamed, said more than any preacher's vow or sheriff's order. They vanished beyond the ridge line, two figures stitched together in silhouette against the rising sun. And the town, left behind, kept its silence, for now. But dust remembers. And so do women who are finally seen. The cabin sat beyond the ridge, where the grasses grew long and wild, unbothered by fences or the scrape of wagon wheels. It was made of hand-hewn timber, roof sloped low to the west, its porch half sunken with time. Smoke curled steady from a chimney. Tomas Red Moon led Annabelle there, without ceremony. He did not speak. She did not ask. But something in the hush between their footsteps said they were crossing a line neither one had planned to find. Inside, the cabin was clean but sparse. A single cot tucked in the corner, a table with worn legs, a stove iron black by years of use. The smell of pine sap and horses lingered faintly in the air. Light poured in through a single east-facing window, soft as breath on skin. Tomas gestured for her to sit by the stove. Then he stepped out without explanation, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. She stood a moment, uncertain. Her fingers touched the rim of a chipped mug resting on the table, the wood still warm beneath her palm. There were no adornments, no woman's touch. Everything here bore the mark of necessity and care. The floorboard swept, the tools arranged, the single coat hanging by the door sewn by hand. It was a quiet life, a capable one, not empty, just undemanding. When Tomas returned, he carried a tin basin of water and a folded cloth. He set them on the table without meeting her gaze, then busied himself at the stove. She could feel him trying to give her distance, even in such a small space. She dipped the cloth into the basin and pressed it to her wrists, red and raw from the rope. The coolness made her wince. "I'll clean them later," she said, mostly to herself. He said nothing, but moved slowly, placing a pan on the stove. The crackle of grease and the scent of onions filled the space, thin but homey. She had eaten little the day before. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been offered food without condition. When he finally set a plate down before her, just fried potatoes, a slice of bread, and stewed beans, she hesitated. He turned away before she could thank him, his silence a shield she had no way of breaching. They ate without words. Only the soft scrape of fork on plate and the wind beyond the window broke the stillness. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He moved with deliberation, each gesture careful. There was nothing uncertain in him, only withheld things. After the meal, he stepped outside again, giving her space to wash. She cleaned the dishes, the cloth, and then herself, best she could. The water stung her wrists, but she was grateful for the sting. It reminded her she was still her own. She didn't ask to stay. He didn't offer. But when dusk folded itself around the cabin, he unrolled a second cot, older, patched, but clean, and set it across the room from his own. A small gesture, one that said, "You are not a guest, but neither are you claimed." That night, she didn't sleep. Not truly. The wind knocked softly against the walls, and every creak of timber felt like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Tomas didn't snore. She could hear his breathing, steady, calm, like a tether to a world that hadn't yet burned her. She turned to face the wall, her back to him, but her thoughts refused to follow. In the days that followed, a rhythm settled in. He rose early, before the sun, and tended to the forge that sat half-built beneath a pine grove out back. She heard the ringing of his hammer through the morning mist, sharp and consistent, like the ticking of a clock that had never broken. She swept the cabin, mended her dress, stirred the pot he left simmering each noon. They passed each other like two birds on the same branch, unsure if they could share the space long enough to build a nest. He brought her a book one afternoon, left it on the table beside her folded shawl. Walt Whitman. She didn't know if he could read it, or if he had simply known she could. She read aloud quietly, when she thought he wasn't listening. Once, she heard a horse whinny near the edge of the grove. When she stepped out, she saw Tomas crouched beside a wounded mare, her leg caught in barbed wire. He worked gently, whispering soft sounds that made no sense to her but calmed the creature. She watched him clean the wound, tie a poultice, and stroke her flank. It was the first time she'd seen him smile. Not at her, but at the horse, the moment, the mercy of still having use for his hands. That night, he left a carving on the windowsill. Small, made of whittled pine. A horse no larger than a fist, with her initials etched under the belly. A simple thing, but it unraveled something tight in her chest. The town didn't forget her. That much was clear. She heard it in the occasional hoofbeats from afar, in the way birds scattered when someone passed near the trail. Once, her aunt came to the ridge. Etta stood by the tree line, bonnet in hand, face pale. "You can't stay here," she'd said, voice trembling. "They'll come. They think Annabelle, please. Come back before they make it worse." Annabelle had looked at her, heart aching. "Worse than what, Aunt Etta? A man offers me silence, safety, and I'm supposed to crawl back to noise and shame." "He's not one of us," her aunt whispered. "I'm not sure I ever was." Her aunt didn't answer. She turned, skirts rustling, and disappeared into the trees. That night, Tomas said her name for the first time. Soft, like checking a bruise. "Annabelle." She looked up. "They'll come," he said. "I know. Do you want to run?" She shook her head slowly. "I'm tired of running from things that never caught me." His eyes lingered a moment, then he nodded, turning back to the coals. They didn't speak again that evening, but the space between them felt changed, not smaller, but clearer, like two paths drawing gently toward the same stream. The next morning, she woke before him. The window was frosted slightly, breath visible in the slant of light. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, the cold biting her bare feet. The earth felt quieter than usual, as if it too was waiting. Behind her, she heard the floorboards shift. He stood at the doorway, coffee in hand. No words, just presence. The cabin, the woods, the forge, and the wind. They all seemed to breathe together for one long moment. She didn't smile, but she didn't need to. She reached up and tucked a lock of her hair behind her ear, feeling the carved horse in her pocket. She wasn't healed, but she was no longer breaking. And somewhere, just beyond the silence, she knew the storm was gathering. But for now there was quiet. For now there was this. And it was enough to stay. The snow came down hard and early, blanketing the high ridge with a kind of silence that muffled even thought. It came overnight, stealthy and absolute, draping the cabin in white and sealing the trail behind a curtain of cold. When Annabelle woke, the windows were pale with frost, and the breath from her mouth rose like ghost smoke in the still air. Tomas had already stoked the fire. He moved slowly now, careful with the logs, the way a man moves when weather has settled not just into the land, but into his bones. He nodded to her when she stirred, eyes steady, as if the storm had been expected all along. "It'll hold," he said simply, meaning the roof, the walls, the food supply, maybe more. She nodded and pulled her shawl tighter. The cabin, though small, felt larger in the storm. Time stretched between the sound of logs cracking. The kettle hissed gently. They each moved with deliberate purpose. She swept the floor, he adjusted the shutters. They spoke little, but there was nothing cold between them. Only a quiet shaped by necessity and a kind of care that did not demand attention. That afternoon, Tomas worked with a horse blanket by the fire, mending a tear with thick thread. Annabelle sat across from him, mending her only good dress, again. The rhythm of stitching was almost meditative, but her thoughts were not. She glanced at his hands. Broad, scarred, patient. Hands that had unbound her. Hands that never reached without purpose. She thought of what her aunt had said. What the town thought. She thought of Silas Greeley's face, twisted with insult. Of the women who clucked their tongues behind her back. "Tomas," she said quietly. He looked up. "Why did you do it? That day?" He paused in his stitching, thread taut between finger and cloth. "Because no one else did." "That's not much of an answer. It's the only one that's true." She studied him. The line of his jaw, the deep quiet in his gaze. He wasn't hiding anything. He just didn't have more to say than that. "People think you want something from me," she murmured, not quite looking at him. He considered that. "I don't." "I know." She went back to her mending, but her heart beat faster, as if a new page had turned in her chest. Later, the wind screamed against the eaves. The storm grew teeth. Branches creaked. The smoke from the chimney bent sideways in the wind's grip. Tomas stepped outside to check the door latch, and when he returned, snow clung to his shoulders. "They won't come in this," he said. She didn't ask who they were. She knew. The townsfolk. Silas. Gossip turned to poison. "They'll wait," she replied, "for the thaw." That night, the cold pressed in from all sides. They shared stew again, root vegetables and dried venison boiled soft. Annabelle ate slowly, her feet tucked beneath her, her eyes occasionally drifting to them. There was no hunger in the look, only a searching. After supper, Tomas crouched near the fire, reaching for a dull knife he meant to sharpen. The light caught the scar at his temple, just above the brow, old and pale, like lightning faded into sky. She set her bowl aside. "Does it hurt?" He looked at her. "No, not anymore." "How did you get it?" He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, slowly, he said, "Battle. I was young. Thought I could stop the dying by standing in front of it." She nodded. "And did you?" He gave a small, rueful smile. "No, but it slowed enough to carry one boy back." She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "You never talk about it." "There's not much use." "Maybe not, but I'd like to know." Tomas studied her for a long while, as if trying to decide whether to open a door that had stayed locked too long. Finally, he told her story, not directly, but the way the old ones did, with space and suggestion. He spoke of a river that once ran red, and how sometimes silence was louder than screams. Of a winter raid and a child who hid beneath a dead horse to survive. Of how he learned that survival was not the same as peace. When he finished, the fire had burned low. She reached across the space between them and laid her hand over his. The contact was light, reverent. Not to comfort, not to fix, just to say, "I hear you." Neither of them pulled away. That night, they slept under the same roof, but not side by side. Still, something had shifted. A kind of breathless understanding had been formed in the firelight. By morning, the snow had stopped, but the cold remained. She stepped outside after breakfast to fetch water and saw tracks by the edge of the trees, hoofprints, faint but present. Her heart tightened. When she returned, Tomas was already lacing his boots, rifle by the door. "They're watching," he said. "Waiting." She nodded. "Let them." He looked at her then, not as someone to protect, but as someone he could stand beside. That day, a small mare was brought down from the ridge, limping badly. Tomas recognized her, a neighbor's horse, gone missing before the snow. She'd stumbled into a hollow and scraped her leg raw, trying to climb out. Together, they brought her inside the shed near the forge. He worked in silence, cutting away the dried blood and packing the wound with moss. Annabelle sat nearby, whispering to calm the animal, her voice soft as new snow. The mare didn't make it. She passed just before sundown, her breath slowing until there were none. Annabelle stroked her neck until the stillness settled fully, then bowed her head. Tomas placed his hand on the mare's flank and stood in silence. She was alone too long. Annabelle looked up. She wasn't in the end. They buried her behind the shed. No ceremony, just quiet earth and a prayer that stayed in the heart. That evening, Annabelle pulled a wool blanket around her shoulders and sat beside the fire. Tomas joined her, setting down 2 mugs of tea, one sweetened with pine honey. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, sipping slowly. She watched the flames dance. "Do you ever think about leaving?" "Sometimes. But I always come back to this." "What is this?" "Stillness. Work. Space to be." She smiled faintly. "That's not what most people want." He turned toward her. "Most people don't know they want it until it's gone." She considered that. "I think I want it." His voice dropped low. "Then stay." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned her head lightly against the frame of the chair. Her fingers brushed the carved horse still kept in her pocket. She didn't need promises. She needed steadiness. And here, in this cold, brutal world, she had found a man who moved like the earth and listened like the sky. Tomorrow would come with new troubles. She felt it rising, like a tide beneath the ice. But for now, in the hush of the storm's wake, there was peace. And peace, once tasted, becomes a hunger all its own. The thaw came not with joy, but with tension braided into the wind. Ice cracked along the ridge like bones shifting beneath flesh, and the snow melted in patches, leaving behind wet earth and prints that should have stayed buried. By the 3rd day of sun, Tomas no longer sharpened tools in the open. He kept his rifle within reach, though he never said it aloud. Annabelle felt it too, a stillness that wasn't peace, but the kind of quiet that arrives before a fuse burns out. She watched the trail each morning, her breath held too long, her hands never still. The town hadn't forgotten. Men like Silas Grilly didn't let wounds scab. They picked and picked until they bled again. She sat on the porch steps, mending the same sleeve for the 2nd time, though it no longer needed mending. Tomas came out with 2 mugs and handed her one. He didn't speak. He hadn't needed to, not since the mare died and her tears had soaked into the shed floor. That had been the turning. Since then his eyes had stayed close to hers, as though a thread ran between them now, fine but unbreakable. "They'll come today," he said finally. She nodded. "I know. You still have time to go." She turned toward him, lifting her chin with a quiet stubbornness that had grown stronger these past weeks. "I'm not hiding." His expression didn't change, but a flicker of respect lit behind his gaze. He sipped his tea, then set it down beside the doorframe. Late morning brought them, a posse of 4 riders, 1 wagon, and enough arrogance to burn a chapel down. Silas rode at the front, his fine coat still pressed, his pistol holstered high like it had never been drawn. Behind him, the sheriff rode heavy in the saddle, eyes weary but set. 2 others flanked them, ranch hands from town, roped into the spectacle. Annabelle stood as they approached, her heart steady despite the drum it beat behind her ribs. Tomas stepped beside her, his presence like stone warmed by fire. He didn't touch her, didn't even look at her. But she felt his calm move through her, quiet as snow melting under sun. The horses stopped in a line just beyond the fence. Silas dismounted with a flourish meant to impress someone, perhaps himself. He removed his gloves slowly, theatrically, as though the world owed him patience. "I came for what's mine," he said, voice raised for show. Annabelle said nothing. The sheriff cleared his throat, but didn't dismount. "We don't want trouble, Tomas." Tomas didn't move. Then turn around. Silas smirked, pacing slowly along the worn dirt path toward the porch. "You took her," he said, voice sharper now. "From the square. In front of witnesses. You humiliated me." Annabelle's voice cut through the air, low and unwavering. "I wasn't taken." Silas turned toward her, startled as though a chair had spoken. "You were mine to marry. You knew it. Everyone knew it." I said no. He blinked. "That doesn't matter." "It does now." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't step forward. But each word hit like stone into water, rippling through the men behind him, through the trees and wind and watching crows. I left with the only man who treated me like I wasn't a thing to be bought. Silas's face twisted, colorizing. You're choosing him? A half-breed blacksmith who sleeps with dogs and doesn't speak English half the time. Annabelle stepped off the porch. Her boots met the earth squarely. I'm choosing myself. I chose peace. I chose silence over your noise. Kindness over your pride. Tomas moved before thought, his hand snapping out, not to strike, but to block the blow. The air cracked as Silas's palm collided with Tomas's arm. It was enough to send Silas stumbling, red with humiliation. Sheriff Dillard finally stepped down, eyes darting between them. That's enough, Silas. She's mine. She's not property, the sheriff snapped, voice firm for the first time. This town may have turned its back, but we don't have laws for ownership. She said no. That's all the law we need. Silas looked around, wildeed, as though expecting someone to protest. No one did. Even the two ranch hands had gone quiet, suddenly finding interest in their reins. She ruined me, he muttered. Annabelle stepped forward one pace. You did that yourself. He looked at her for a long time, something in him breaking. Not a clean crack, but a slow crumble. Then he turned, got on his horse, and rode off without another word. The others followed. Only the sheriff lingered, hat in hand. You'll still be talked about, he said gently. Martha Tolliver's probably rehearsing a speech already. Annabelle smiled faintly. Let her. Talk never killed me. But silence almost did. The sheriff nodded once, then mounted and followed the trail back down the ridge. When the dust settled and the wind returned, Tomas turned to her. You didn't have to do that. Yes, she said softly. I did. He studied her, then walked back toward the porch. She followed. The kettle had cooled, so she poured the last of the tea and refilled it with water. As it began to steam again, she stood beside the hearth, hands wrapped around her cup. He'll try something again, Tomas said. I know, but not here. Not today. No, she agreed. Not ever the same way again. She stepped out onto the porch, the sky wide and blue above, the smell of thawing earth rising like memory. Tomas joined her, his hand brushing hers, not to possess, not to claim, just to remind her that she wasn't alone in the stillness anymore. You still want to stay? He asked. She looked out across the valley. Spring had not yet taken hold, but the bones of it were there, green just beneath the surface, waiting. So was she. I don't want to stay, she said. I want to grow. He nodded once, like he understood that more than any vow ever could. Then he offered his hand, not the way he had in the square, with silent courage and hope, but now with quiet partnership. A gesture that asked nothing and gave everything. She took it. There was no kiss, no embrace, no sweeping declaration. Just two souls at the edge of something real, rooted not in fireworks, but in earned ground. Later that week, they buried the old mare's bridle behind the shed, a symbol, she said, of all the things that had once bound her. He carved her a new one, for a horse they hadn't met yet. Days passed. The town gossiped. But no one came to the ridge again. Silence returned, not the punishing kind, but the sort that allowed things to bloom. Annabelle rose with the sun now. Her sleeves were mended. Her voice, when she spoke, held more weight. She walked the trails without looking over her shoulder. And when she sat beside Tomas, there was no space between them anymore. Only warmth. Only wind. Time passed. Grass returned. And the roots held. In the end, it wasn't escape that saved her. It was choosing a place where silence wasn't punishment, but promise. And someone who knew that freedom wasn't given. It was offered, with a hand and no words at all. Now she stood unbowed, beside a man who had seen her and never needed to fix her. That was the kind of love no one talks about. But the earth remembers. And the wind, when it passes through pine, carries it for those who still listen. Some loves are loud, bold, and immediate. But others are quiet things, earned and enduring, born of stillness, shame, and the grace of being seen. If ever your name is dragged through the dust, may someone offer you their hand, not to save you, but to walk beside you while you save yourself.